Something is deeply wrong at the highest levels of China's leadership, and it is not the kind of problem the government openly talks about. It is not something that appears in official statements or on state television. It is the kind of crisis that shows itself through disappearances, through officials who suddenly stop showing up in public, through military leaders who are missing from important ceremonies where they were once expected to stand front and center. It appears in promotions that never happen, resignations that are never fully explained, and in the heavy silence that spreads through an entire military system when something serious has gone terribly wrong and nobody is allowed to discuss it publicly. That silence has been moving through China's People's Liberation Army for far longer than many outside experts first understood. Now, the scale of what has been unfolding inside the most powerful military command structure in Asia has become impossible to ignore. Senior generals have disappeared from public view. Rocket force commanders responsible for controlling China's nuclear weapons program have vanished from the spotlight. Defense ministers have been removed under mysterious circumstances that the Chinese government still refuses to clearly explain. And standing at the center of all of this is Xi Jinping himself, making the decisions, overseeing the purges, and watching the networks of loyalty around him begin to weaken and collapse. Xi Jinping spent more than a decade building more personal power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, but now he is facing the same reality that many leaders eventually face when they chase absolute control. The closer someone gets to complete power, the harder it becomes to trust the very people who helped build that power in the first place. Stay with this carefully, because what is happening inside China's military right now is not simply a story about political struggles behind closed doors. This is a story about what happens when the command structure of a nuclear superpower begins to crack from the inside, and the consequences of those cracks extend far beyond China itself. To fully understand how China reached this moment, you have to go back even before 2012, the year Xi Jinping officially became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. You have to look at the decades before that, when Xi watched earlier generations of Chinese leaders manage a political system built on powerful factions, political alliances, and carefully balanced networks inside the Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party was never one completely united organization. It always contained competing groups with different histories, different regional loyalties, and different political traditions. One major network was made up of the children of revolutionary leaders, often called the princelings. Another network included officials connected to the Communist Youth League, which was closely linked to Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao. A third major faction was the Shanghai clique connected to Jiang Zemin, who dominated Chinese politics from the 1990s into the early 2000s. These groups competed against each other, negotiated with each other, and shared power through compromise. Even when it looked like one leader was fully in charge, power inside the system was still divided and balanced across different factions. Xi Jinping looked at that structure and believed it was dangerous. In his view, the division of power inside the Communist Party was not a strength. He believed it was a serious weakness. He believed it created corruption, and on that point he was correct. He also believed it created divided loyalties inside the military, and again, he was not entirely wrong. But more importantly, Xi believed that a system with competing factions limited what any single leader could accomplish. And Xi Jinping had very clear goals that he wanted to achieve. From the moment he took power, he moved carefully and aggressively to break apart the old faction system and replace it with something very different. He wanted a structure that looked far more like the system Mao Zedong controlled during the early decades of communist China, where nearly all authority flowed directly through one central leader. The tool Xi used to achieve this was the anti-corruption campaign. The anti-corruption campaign launched by Xi Jinping during the first years of his leadership was massive by almost any historical standard. The investigations carried out by the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection produced shocking numbers. Hundreds of thousands of government officials were investigated. Tens of thousands faced prosecution. Senior figures throughout the Communist Party and government system were removed from office, placed on trial, convicted, and imprisoned. Officials who once appeared untouchable because of their rank or political connections suddenly found themselves sitting in detention centers answering questions they probably never imagined anyone would dare ask them. At first, many outside observers believed the campaign was genuine because corruption inside China truly was widespread and deeply rooted. There was certainly no shortage of real corruption cases to investigate, But as the campaign continued year after year and reached deeper into the highest levels of the Communist Party, a clearer pattern started to emerge. The corruption investigations were real, and many of the crimes uncovered were also very real. But the people being targeted were not chosen randomly. They were often selected because of their connection to political factions that competed with Xi Jinping's growing power base. Officials loyal to Xi frequently survived investigations that could have destroyed their careers under different circumstances. Officials who lacked loyalty to Xi often saw their careers suddenly end. The pattern was not perfect every single time, but it became obvious enough that many serious analysts of Chinese politics began describing the campaign not simply as an effort to fight corruption, but as a large political consolidation operation hidden beneath the language of anti-corruption reform. Nowhere was this more important than inside the military itself. China's People's Liberation Army had become one of the environments most heavily affected by corruption. Over many years, the process of military promotions and assignments slowly turned into a system based heavily on money and personal deals. Promotions could be purchased. Important command positions could be bought. Officers who wanted to rise through the ranks understood that advancement often depended on making payments to senior officials above them, who then passed money even higher through the chain of command. This was not a hidden secret inside the military. It was widely understood as part of how the system functioned. Xi Jinping used the anti-corruption campaign to destroy large parts of this system, and in doing so, he achieved something that no Chinese leader had successfully achieved in decades. He gained direct personal control over the military. The officers who remained in power were officially seen as Xi's officers. Their appointments carried his approval, and their loyalty, at least publicly, belonged directly to him. But this is the part many people outside China do not fully understand. Removing corrupt officials and replacing them with loyal officials does not automatically fix the deeper problems that created corruption in the first place. In many ways, it only hides those problems under a different surface. The new officers who rose through the system were often chosen more for loyalty than pure competence. They entered the same system, faced the same pressures, and operated inside the same structure that had encouraged corruption before. And they understood something very clearly. Just like the officers before them, they knew that survival depended on telling the leader at the top exactly what he wanted to hear. That reality became impossible to ignore as more scandals exploded inside China's military leadership. Li Shangfu, one of China's defense ministers, disappeared from public view before eventually being removed and placed under investigation. His predecessor, Wei Fenghe, was expelled from the Communist Party in 2024 and investigated for bribery, abuse of power, and severe violations of party discipline. Think carefully about how serious that is. China removed 2 consecutive defense ministers within roughly 2 years, both under corruption investigations. In any country, the removal of a defense minister is a major political event. But when 2 defense ministers disappear one after another under similar accusations in such a short period of time, it points to something much larger than isolated wrongdoing. It points to a deeper structural failure inside the system itself. A government might explain one corrupt defense minister as a mistake in judgment or a failure in background checks. But when the replacement defense minister also falls under investigation after being specifically chosen to restore trust, it reveals a much bigger problem inside the leadership structure. The deeper issue is this: Xi Jinping's system for choosing top military leaders has increasingly rewarded loyalty above all else, often placing loyalty ahead of competence and long-term integrity. The result is a military leadership class that has become highly skilled at proving loyalty to Xi Jinping, but not always highly skilled at carrying out the real responsibilities that military leadership requires. It is important to slowly understand the consequences of this, because the implications are enormous. Over more than a decade, Xi Jinping built a military command structure centered almost entirely around his personal authority. The Central Military Commission, which Xi personally leads, sits at the very top of military power in China. Every major military appointment, every major strategic decision, and every large procurement program ultimately moves through structures that answer directly to him. From Xi's perspective, this solved the old faction problem because it created one unified command with one central authority figure. But concentrating power this heavily also creates a dangerous weakness, because a system built around one central authority also creates one central point of failure. When the information flowing upward through that system becomes distorted, When military officers at every level feel pressure to report success and hide problems, and when honesty becomes dangerous while displays of loyalty become rewarded, the leader at the very top slowly loses contact with reality. Decisions begin getting made based on military capabilities that may not actually exist. Timelines are approved that cannot realistically be achieved. Confidence is projected outward, while serious weaknesses remain hidden underneath the surface. This problem is not unique to China. It is one of the oldest and most dangerous problems inside authoritarian systems throughout history. Leaders who only reward good news eventually stop hearing the truth altogether. Over time, the gap between what the leader believes and what is actually happening grows larger and larger. Every hidden report, every dishonest subordinate, and every official more focused on personal survival than honest assessment makes the situation worse. What the rocket force scandal strongly suggests is that this dangerous gap has now opened inside China's military system itself. It suggests that Xi Jinping may have been operating with an inaccurate understanding of some of China's most critical military capabilities. Even more troubling, it suggests that the very system designed to prevent these problems, including anti-corruption campaigns, strict party discipline, and aggressive punishment for disloyalty, may have actually made the situation worse. Why? Because those measures created an atmosphere so hostile toward bad news that eventually bad news stopped reaching the top leadership entirely. Then the crisis expanded even further. The purges did not end with the rocket force, and they did not stop with the defense ministers. Investigations spread rapidly through other branches of China's military and defense system. Officials connected to the Central Military Commission's Equipment Development Department, the organization responsible for overseeing military procurement, suddenly came under investigation. Officers inside the Navy, the Strategic Support Force, and the Joint Logistics Support Force found themselves caught inside expanding corruption probes that moved faster than many could react to. The investigations also spread into China's defense industry itself. Executives running major state-owned defense companies, the same companies responsible for producing weapons and technology for China's military modernization programs, were removed from office, investigated, and expelled from the Communist Party. The scale of the purge created an entirely new problem because when investigations hit this many people across this many institutions at the same time, the effect goes far beyond simply removing corrupt individuals. It creates fear across the entire organization. Officials who have not even been accused of wrongdoing begin avoiding decisions because they fear becoming future targets. Entire institutions slow down. People become extremely cautious. Organizations that normally need to make thousands of decisions every week in order to function efficiently begin delaying decisions, avoiding responsibility, or refusing to act altogether. Military readiness depends on action. It depends on leaders making decisions quickly and confidently. It depends on officers who are willing to take initiative, use judgment, and respond to changing situations without hesitation. But an officer corps living in constant fear of investigation does not behave that way. Instead, it becomes cautious and defensive. Officers begin waiting for approval before acting. They focus on paperwork, protecting themselves, and avoiding mistakes that could attract unwanted attention. They do only what is necessary to prove loyalty while avoiding anything that might place them under suspicion. A military operating under those conditions is very different from the powerful and disciplined force Xi Jinping has presented to the rest of the world. The international consequences of this growing fracture inside China's military deserve very serious attention. Over the past several years, China's military posture has become increasingly aggressive and more assertive across multiple regions. In the South China Sea, where China's territorial claims directly overlap with those of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, Chinese naval and coast guard activity has steadily intensified. In the Taiwan Strait, Chinese military exercises have become larger, more frequent, and more openly provocative. Near Japan, Chinese military aircraft have repeatedly entered and tested air defense identification zones with increasing regularity. At the same time, Chinese officials on the diplomatic stage have spoken with growing confidence about China's military strength and its willingness to use that strength if necessary. But all of that confidence depends on one critical assumption. The assumption is that the military capabilities China projects to the world are completely real and fully operational. Think specifically about Taiwan. because Taiwan remains the issue that dominates the thinking of military planners throughout the Pacific region. For years, the main debate among Western defense experts has not been about whether China could attempt some kind of coercive move against Taiwan. The debate has focused more on when such an action could happen. Analysts have discussed specific years, possible windows of opportunity, and projected timelines based on what they believed the People's Liberation Army was capable of achieving militarily. Those timelines were built on intelligence assessments about China's military readiness and operational strength. But if those assessments were based on information that had already been distorted by corruption, exaggerated readiness reports, or procurement officials claiming capabilities that did not truly exist, then the entire picture changes. If officers reported success simply because leadership wanted to hear success, rather than reporting operational reality honestly, then the assumptions guiding regional strategy may be deeply flawed. That is not a small issue. It is the kind of intelligence failure that can reshape the geopolitical balance across an entire region. Again, everything depends on the assumption that the capabilities China presents to the world are accurate. The assumption is that the systems work as advertised, that the readiness levels are genuine, and that when Chinese leaders describe military strength, they are speaking from a position of accurate knowledge rather than distorted information. But the scandals surrounding the rocket force and the wider defense establishment have now created a question that no outside analyst can answer with total certainty. Yet nearly every serious analyst is now asking it. How much of China's projected military capability is actually accurate? And how much of it may reflect reports given to Xi Jinping by officers who felt enormous pressure to exaggerate readiness and hide weaknesses because admitting problems could destroy their careers? This question becomes especially important when discussing Taiwan. The military scenarios modeled for years by planners in the United States, Japan, Australia, and Taiwan itself all assume certain Chinese capabilities. If those capabilities are significantly different from what has been assumed, then the entire strategic picture changes. The risk calculations change, the military models change, the assumptions guiding leaders in Washington, Tokyo, Taipei, and Beijing all begin shifting at the same time. A military that overestimates its own strength creates a very specific kind of danger. The danger is not simply that the military is powerful. The danger is that its own leadership may believe in capabilities that are weaker than they appear, leading them into situations where reality only becomes visible during an actual crisis or conflict. There are analysts who have studied the People's Liberation Army for decades who argue that the current purges inside China's military are actually evidence of Xi Jinping's strength rather than weakness. They argue that Xi's willingness to remove even the most senior officers proves that his control is so complete that nobody inside the system is untouchable. According to this argument, the purges do not show weakness in Xi's authority. Instead, they supposedly show the tightening of his grip on power. There is some logic to that argument. After all, only a leader with enormous power could remove multiple defense ministers, investigate commanders connected to China's nuclear arsenal, and carry out investigations across several military branches without triggering a coup or visible resistance. In that narrow sense, the purges do demonstrate a certain level of control and authority. But there is another way to interpret the same events, and that interpretation has been gaining support among many experienced China analysts. A leader who must conduct purges on this scale, this frequently, and across a military system that he personally spent more than a decade shaping, may actually be revealing that the system he created is not functioning the way he believed it would. Instead of tightening control over a stable structure, he may be trying to repair a structure that is beginning to crack under pressure. Under this interpretation, the purges are not proof of complete control. They are evidence of the limits of control itself. Because the absolute loyalty Xi Jinping has demanded for more than a decade is not the same thing as reliable performance or true competence. A leader can force officials to publicly declare loyalty, but loyalty alone does not automatically create skill, honesty, or effectiveness. A leader can punish dishonesty once it is discovered, but dishonesty that never reaches the top because everyone is too afraid to speak honestly becomes far more dangerous. A leader can remove officers who fail, but removing individual people does not erase the culture that allowed problems to stay hidden until it was too late. A military culture cannot simply be purged the same way an individual general can. That is the central paradox inside China's military leadership today. The mechanisms of control are technically functioning exactly the way Xi Jinping designed them to function. Investigations are happening. Officials accused of disloyalty are being removed. Purges continue moving through the system. Yet despite all of this, the same underlying problems continue appearing because the deeper issue was never simply about disloyalty. The real issue is the kind of environment that extreme concentration of power creates. It creates a system where speaking honestly becomes dangerous, where officials learn to protect themselves by hiding uncomfortable truths, and where the gap between reality and the information presented to leadership grows larger year after year, no matter how many people are punished. History shows that there are moments when powerful governments reach a point where the internal contradictions inside their systems become impossible to fully control. At that stage, more purges no longer solve the problem. Stricter discipline no longer fixes the system. Removing another defense minister or another general no longer changes the deeper reality. Eventually, the contradictions built into the system itself begin forcing the state to confront what those contradictions truly mean. There is an important historical comparison worth considering here. During the final decades of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Red Army projected an image of enormous military strength. Military parades appeared highly organized and powerful. Official claims about Soviet military capability sounded overwhelming. But inside the system, the officer corps had been shaped for decades by political structures that rewarded loyalty to leadership while discouraging independent thinking and honest initiative. When the Soviet military became deeply involved in Afghanistan, the gap between the image of strength and the operational reality became impossible to fully hide. The Soviet military struggled with the practical demands of a difficult and prolonged conflict in ways that surprised even many Soviet leaders themselves. Of course, China today is not the Soviet Union, and the People's Liberation Army is not the Soviet Red Army. The situations are clearly different, and those differences matter. But the underlying structural problem is very similar. When systems prioritize political loyalty above honest reporting, a dangerous gap eventually forms between projected capability and real capability. That dynamic is not unique to one country or one ideology. It is a recurring feature of highly centralized systems where delivering bad news to leadership becomes risky enough that people gradually stop delivering bad news altogether. Xi Jinping is not a weak or fragile leader. No serious analyst currently believes he is likely to be removed through a military coup or overthrown by a mass uprising anytime soon. His control over China's formal political structures remains strong and very real. What has weakened is not his official position or title. What has weakened is confidence in whether the military system beneath him truly matches the image it projects outward to the world. Once confidence like that begins to crack, restoring it becomes extremely difficult. It becomes difficult for Xi Jinping himself. It becomes difficult for officers beneath him who now understand that failure can lead not only to removal from office, but also public disgrace and criminal investigation. It becomes difficult for defense industry companies trying to operate inside a procurement system where nearly any transaction could later become the target of corruption accusations. And it becomes difficult for military planners who now have to base strategic decisions on capability assessments that may already have been proven unreliable in important areas.